Who's the greatest fighter to ever compete in every single mixed martial arts weight class? Well, the answer to the women's strawweight division isn't as straightforward as some of these other ones. Joanna Jędrzejczyk was the longest-serving champion and arguably the most dominant, but she lost twice to the current 115 queen Weili Zhang. Of course, Rose Namajunas is a two-time champ at strawweight who holds 2 wins over both Zhang and Jędrzejczyk, but she kind of faded out of the conversation after her fight with Carlo Esparza. We think Zhang is simply the best example of a 115-pound fighter the UFC has seen. The most well-rounded, the most dangerous, and even if she hasn't ended the GOAT conversation just yet, chances are she will before too long. So that's our opening pick. The flyweight division is a lot simpler. Valentina Shevchenko is by far the most dominant and impressive women's flyweight in UFC history. She may have lost her title to Alexa Grasso and then narrowly failed to win it back, but Shevchenko is already so far ahead of her competition here. This one is barely a contest. While we're on the subject of divisional discussions that are not remotely competitive, Amanda Nunes is not only the greatest 135-pound and 145-pound fighter to ever compete in these divisions, but she's by far and away the GOAT of women's MMA. Nunes has beaten and finished nearly every former champion in UFC history. Most of them were in the first round. There's no discussion to have here. Let's move on. Trust us, there are a few interesting debates to be had further up the list, but for now, the first men's division we'll feature just so happens to have the longest-serving champion in the history of the UFC. In a head-to-head, prime for prime, it would certainly be interesting to see how Demetrius Johnson would deal with the likes of Alexander Pantoja, Brandon Moreno, and Davison Figueiredo. Because make no mistake, this division has indeed gotten a lot better since Mighty Mouse's reign, but the length of that title run, coupled with the fact that DJ is still out there putting on sublime performances in one championship, makes this a total no-brainer. Remember, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a single upload. The 135-pound pick was maybe the toughest one of the lot. On one hand, TJ Dillashaw's resume is pretty outstanding, and the way he destroyed the once great Renan Barão was one of the all-time title-winning performances. But when you look at the WEC run of Dominick Cruz, how he then entered the UFC in similar form before suffering a string of injuries that would have ruined 99% of fighters, and yet he somehow managed to come back and beat TJ Dillashaw in a tightly contested 5-rounder? Yeah, Dominick Cruz is still the GOAT for us. He was so far ahead of the pack during his prime, and even in his more recent performances, he was beating solid top 15 contenders, and was even putting on a great performance against Marlon Vera until Cheeto kicked him in the head. Cruz remains the pick here, but not by a huge margin. This one might be controversial. How can a GOAT fighter have losses to pretty much every other contender to the GOAT throne and still come out on top? Well, Jose Aldo's title reign was the stuff of legend, and despite his defeats to Alexander Volkanovski, Conor McGregor, and Max Holloway, it's still hard to deny him. Volk is the number 2 for sure, but Aldo as champion was truly carving out one of the greatest runs of all time before he eventually met his maker. And while sure, his resurgence at bantamweight doesn't add to his featherweight legacy on paper, it does prove just how good Aldo was and continues to be. Featherweight was a tough one. When you get MMA math involved, it's understandable that some people would pick Volk, but for us, he still falls just barely short of what Jose Aldo was doing during the best years of his career. 10 years undefeated, and with 9 major title defenses across the UFC and the WEC, which was basically the same division until the UFC absorbed the WEC and created their own 145-pound roster. For now, Aldo remains the pick. This one shouldn't be too controversial. Khabib Nurmagomedov might have gotten out of the sport earlier than we might have hoped, but during his time in the top flight, he was able to carve out dominant wins over some of the greatest fighters of his era. BJ Penn, who was considered the GOAT at one point, was too inconsistent and had too severe a drop-off in form to be considered for the top spot. Khabib might not have hung around to test himself against the next generation, but what he did show us was some of the highest levels of mixed martial arts performances we've ever seen. The Eagle legitimately changed the game during his peak years. Though his successor Islam Makhachev is looking incredibly impressive, he still has his work cut out to overtake his childhood friend and training partner. There was a point in time where people were having conversations about Kamaru Usman and his place in the GOAT race. Anyone who watched the legendary Georges St. Pierre during his peak years will know that there isn't really a comparison to make, beyond how they would do in an actual head-to-head fight, because GSP was as dominant a presence as any division has ever seen, a fighting supercomputer who had the perfect game plan to beat all of his contemporaries. He beat the greats of the generation before him, beat those who came up during his own time, then even started picking off some newer contenders. St. Pierre is in many ways the benchmark for greatness when it comes to longtime champions. His technical skills were light years ahead of his time, and his resume is stacked with truly great names that a lot of newer fans would do well to know better. GSP is the king at welterweight, and it likely won't change anytime soon. Like GSP, Standards for what a champion should be in the middleweight division was defined by the reign of Anderson Silva. He was the fighter that captured the imagination of the fans more than any other athlete in MMA history. So many iconic moments, classic finishes. The Spider just had more poster-worthy moments than anyone who's ever laced up gloves and fought. To this day, though we've seen guys like Israel Adesanya and Robert Whittaker turn in some amazing work, Silva still holds the UFC record for the longest win streak the promotion has ever seen, and it's not hard to see why he's miles ahead of his competition here. The most electric finisher in MMA history, and probably the most inspired striker to ever consistently win at the highest level. Another pretty straightforward pick comes in next. Who could you really see as competition to Jon Jones's status as the 205-pound GOAT? Daniel Cormier? We all know how that rivalry turned out, and even long-serving champions like Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz just couldn't sustain their greatness like Jon has, and even still, they were never close to Bones' levels. Jon Jones is a troubled figure, a controversial presence within the sport, and yet he remains probably the most perfect example of an MMA fighter to ever do it. Jones is the ideal physical specimen, a technical marvel, and a total genius when it comes to all things mixed martial arts. Likely the easiest pick of the lot. The heavyweight pick is a little more complicated, but there's logic behind our choice. Fedor Emelianenko was as good a fighter as the sport has ever seen during that decade-long run in Pride. And while sure, some critics might point out some of the dodgy matchmaking during his run, the carnival-esque fights that were sprinkled in, but Fedor also beat some of the greatest fighters of his era. You can't boil the last Emperor's run down to the sideshow fights that were scattered around his reign. Fedor didn't look like much of an athlete, and often gave up a size difference to his opponents, but he remains one of the most well-rounded fighters of all time. The way he just always found a route to victory during his peak was truly astonishing. There's a reason why it took years for someone to finally break 3 title defenses in the UFC in this division. The margin for error is so low, and while Stipe Miocic has his own argument, the fact that Fedor did what he did for so long is just on another level in our book.